Welcome to the first video of the Fundamentals of Biology. In this video, we will be covering bonding, water, and the elements. So the first kind of bond is the covalent bond, which is basically the sharing of electrons between the actual atoms. And they can differ in the number of total electrons shared. So you can see that in a single covalent bond, for example, the H2, there's only one pair of electrons that are shared. So there are two total electrons that are shared. And these are the valence electrons. And for a double covalent bond, as you can see in O2, you can see that there are two pairs of electrons that are shared between just the valence electrons. So you can see that they're on the outside, and there are a total of 4 electrons that are shared. Along with the electrons that are shared, the atom's actual pull for the electrons can differ. This concept is called electronegativity, which means that some atoms are able to pull electrons better than others. So you can see in like a nonpolar covalent bond, there is an equal pull for electrons, and there would be a small electronegativity difference. So an example of this would be like H2, because these two atoms would share the electron equally. But however, in a polar covalent bond, there's an unequal pull for electrons, since there's a large electronegativity difference. You can see an example of this would be like water, where the hydrogen and the oxygen would have different pulls for electrons. The second type of bond is the ionic bond, which is an actual transfer of valence electrons. So you can see in the covalent bond, they're sharing the electrons. But however, in an ionic bond, this atom will actually be transferred over here, and they're going to basically create ions. The anion has a negative charge because it is gaining this electron, which will make it negative, whereas a cation will have a positive charge, since it will be losing a negative charge from this valence electron over here. The third type of bond is not actually a type of bond. It's called the hydrogen bond, but it's actually an intermolecular force between the molecules. You will learn this more in like chemistry classes. So you can see that it is especially prevalent in water, and you can see that the oxygen has a negative electronegativity, whereas the hydrogen have a positive electronegativity. So the positive charge of the hydrogen will always attach with the negative charge of the oxygen in these polar strong intermolecular forces. And hydrogen bonds will usually occur when one hydrogen from one molecule will attach to a fluorine, an oxygen, or nitrogen from another molecule. One thing about water that makes it so special is its polarity, and as I mentioned earlier, it is very electronegative between the hydrogen and the oxygen. So here are some things that make it special. So the first thing we have to talk about is over here. You can see that it dissolves polar substances and ionic substances. It is because that water is a very polar substance by itself. So it will be able to dissolve other polar things and also ionic things like NaCl, which is table salt. And you can see in this second picture, you can see that it separates from nonpolar substances because polar substances do not mix with nonpolar substances, which is why you see oil will not mix together with it. And then you can see in this picture over here, you can see the surface tension, which is why some certain animals are able to walk on top of water. And this is due to like the strong intermolecular forces that exist on top of the water. And related to this is cohesion, which is how water is able to stick basically to itself, and adhesion, which is how water is able to stick to other substances, which is why you can see on a graduated cylinder, you can see a meniscus form, which is because the water clings to the side. Another thing about water is it expands upon freezing. This is because during freezing, it forms a crystalline structure. So instead of shrinking like you would think by collapsing in on itself, it actually forms a rigid structure, which is bigger than if it was in a liquid form. And finally, another idea about water is the idea of high heat of vaporization and heat capacity. So high heat of vaporization means it takes a lot of energy for the water to actually become a gas. and at high heat capacity means it will take a lot of energy to raise the temperature of water, which is why you see more stable temperatures around like beaches and coastal areas, because it takes a lot of energy for the water to change temperature. So the water will make the land, I guess, have more stable temperatures as well. Uh, Another thing is the pH scale, which is a measure of a substance's acidity. So let's just start with a pH of 0. And to talk about the pH scale, what pH actually means is it takes the negative log of the hydrogen plus concentration of the substance. So, for example, in a pH of 0, it will be extremely acidic, so it's going to have the most H plus concentration. So it's going to have 1 times 10 to the 0, which is how you, so basically you can see if you have a pH of 0, the H plus concentration will be 1 times 10 to that number. And related to this is the opposite of that, which is the OH minus concentration. And how you find the OH minus concentration is you take 0 and you have to do 14 minus that number. So you can see that the OH concentration will be 1 times 10 to the negative 14. However, on the other end, if you have a pH of 14, which is extremely basic, the opposite of acidity, your H plus concentration is going to be the smallest. So you're going to do 1 times 10 to the negative 14. However, the OH concentration will be 1 times 10 to the 0. So it's basically reverse. So if we cut down the middle, you can see that a pH of 7 will have an H plus concentration of 1 times 10 to the negative 7, which we found because 7, and you just move it over here. And the OH negative concentration will be 1 times 10 to the negative 7 as well, because 14 minus 7 is also 7. So let's just do an example. So let's take a pH of 5. So what would be the H plus concentration for this? Well, we know that it's 1 times 10 to the something, and since it's a 5, we can just put a negative 5 here. So how do we find the OH minus concentration? The OH minus concentration will be 14 minus 5 for the exponent and the negative of that. So it would be 1 times 10 to the negative 9. So just remember that the H plus concentration, as you move up 1 pH, it's going to it's going to be smaller by a factor of 10. However, the OH minus concentration is going to increase by a factor of 10. And the last thing we'll talk about is the functional groups. So the functional groups are basically common groupings of elements that we find in the real world. And here are a few major ones. So the hydroxyl group is composed of an OH, and that's attached to a carbon. These are called alcohols, and they're usually used for dissolving polar compounds. The next group is a carbonyl group, and this is a carbon which is double bonded with an oxygen. When a carbonyl is in the middle of a molecule, it is usually called a ketone. As you can see here, it is in the middle of a molecule. However, if it's at the end and has another H attached to it, it's called a aldehyde. And this R is basically just a compound which composed of usually carbon and hydrogen. A carboxyl group is similar to the hydroxyl group, except it has a double bonded oxygen to the carbon along with the OH. These are usually referred to as carboxylic acids. And the next functional group is called the amino group, which is formed with 2 hydrogen atoms attached to a nitrogen and acts as a base. The next one is a sulfhydryl group, and this is made up of a hydrogen attached to a sulfur attached to a molecule. And it basically stabilizes proteins. That's its main job. They're referred to as thiols. A phosphate group has a chemical formula of pH 4 -2 and is used in ATP and phospholipids. And finally, a methyl group has a chemical equation CH3 and usually affects gene expression. So thanks for watching. This video covered covalent ionic hydrogen bonds. It also covered water, pH scale, and functional groups.